Hello and welcome back. I'm Eleni, the owner of Learning Loft Education, where we do tutoring for English from Year 7 to Year 12. This is episode 2 of our Breaking Down series. So let's get into it. So in today's episode, we are going to be going over creating text, which is in Unit 3, Area Study 1. Now, we wanted to release both the text response, or reading and responding to text, and the creating text pretty early on because schools sometimes flip them around. Some of my students are going to be doing creating text first, some are going to be doing the text response first. So we wanted you guys to have the options. Either way, you're going to be doing both by the end of the semester. So let's get into what we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to be looking at the difference between Year 11 creating text or crafting text and the Year 12 creating text. And then we're going to look at the actual task itself. What is the SACs around creating text? And then the framework of ideas. What is a framework of idea? What are your options? What's going on? We're going to talk about mentor text as well. We're going to talk about the 4 main areas that VCAA have outlined that need to be considered when you're writing. We're going to talk about titles and stimuli. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with the VCAA rubric and what is being expected of you in the exam. So let's get into Year 11 versus Year 12. What is the difference between last year for most of you and this year? So basically, in Year 11, a lot of the crafting texts is structured for you. There's a lot more specificity. There's a lot more rules around it so that you guys can be guided into developing your abilities to craft a text with a little bit more scaffolding, a little bit more guidance, basically. In Year 12, most schools give you a bit more freedom than that. There's a lot more emphasis on personal experiences and what you enjoy and what you like writing about in association with your framework of ideas, of course, but we'll get into that. There is a lot more exploration and reflection in it, and there's a bit more room for individual interpretation, sometimes in the SAC, but mostly in the exam. Let's get into the task itself, right? So this is the actual SACs that we're talking about in Year 12. So recently they changed this description. So we're going to talk about the most recent one in the October 2024 updated version of the study design. Okay, so there are 2 main overarching tasks: the actual text that you're creating and a reflection of some sort. So let's break down what all of this actually really means. Okay, so in your SACs, you'll either be completing 1 written text, roughly 700 to 900 words, or 2 smaller written texts, 400, 450 words each. Then we've got your reflection, statement of intention, written explanation. Schools call it different things. Okay, roughly VCAA have said about 400 words for that one. So some schools will be assessing this over multiple periods. Some will do it in similar conditions to the exam. Usually it's a mix of both, right? So if you're doing multiple texts, last year in the 2024 implementation of this study design, Year 12s had to do 2 written texts and a commentary. The 2 written texts were roughly being about the same as if you were doing 1 in this option, so 700, 900 words. So they actually did a lot more, basically. And so often I found that the first one would be over multiple periods. It'd be a bit more stretched out. The second one would be a little bit more exam style. Exam conditions, stricter time conditions. Maybe you could bring a couple of dot points in the first one, and the second one you couldn't do anything, right? So how they're going to implement it will vary very differently from schools, okay? Whatever your school picks, whether you do the 1, whether you do the 2 smaller ones, exam conditions, multiple periods, that will vary completely. It is totally up to your school how they do it. There are some limitations to it, but majority schools are picking what they think is best for their cohort. Now, let's look at the actual SACs in the scope of the entire Year 12 study design, right? So what we've outlined in black is the Area Study 2 creating texts. So now it's a little bit more complicated with the 2 options, but we're going to go through what the difference is, okay? So I want to remind everyone that each unit is worth 100 marks, and each unit is worth 25% of your study score. So the 2 units, 25, the exam, 50 in English. So let's go through option 1. So this is the longer text option where you're writing 1 written piece worth 40 marks and an explanation worth 20 marks. In combination, 60 marks out of the Unit 3's 100 marks available. So, as I said before, because Unit 3 is worth 25% of your study score, each section is worth 10% and 5%. So the written text is 10% of your study score, the explanation 5% of your study score. Collectively, all of the creating text area study 2 is worth 15% of your study score. This is collectively the highest weighting out of all the SACs for an area study. Okay? It is multiple pieces, but collectively it is worth the highest out of all of them. Option 2. This is if your school chooses to split it into 2 smaller texts. Okay? The shorter text option. So each component then is worth 20 marks each, still adds up to 60 marks out of the 100 for Unit 3. Unit 3 will still remain 25% of your study score. Therefore, each piece is worth 5%, collectively still worth the same thing. Okay? 15% of your study score. Still collectively the highest out of all SACs. So whichever option your school picks for you guys, they may even give you the option. We don't know. This is a new thing. We'll see what happens. But whichever option, the collective thing is still going to be the same. Okay? It's just what individual texts may be worth will change, depending on whether you pick the shorter one or the longer one. Okay? Let's talk about the framework of ideas. So this is a big new thing that they've implemented when it comes to creative writing, creating texts. In the previous study design, this was not there. The equivalent, which is somewhat similar to the old creative, was completely different. You had to read a book or a text from the text response list and write a creative piece in response to it. Now you have more framework of ideas, concepts basically. So let's talk about what they are and what your options are. Your school will pick for you though. Let me be clear. Your school will be picking your framework of ideas that you will be doing in the SACs and what they want you to do in the exam. So VCAA have picked a set of 4 options, okay? You cannot write beyond any of these options. It has to be one of these 4 options your school will pick for SACs and what they want you to do in the exam. So country, protest, personal journeys, play. In my experience, the most popular options are protest and personal journeys. Last year, I had 18 year 12s. None had country. 3 had play, same school. Everyone else had protest and personal journeys. You get the examiner's report. Hopefully, they'll tell us the ratios of how many students wrote on country, protest, personal journeys, and play. Okay, I'm going to become tiny and in the middle because this slide has a lot of words on it and I will definitely be in the way. So let's talk about some of the elaborations that VCAA have provided when it comes to each framework of idea. So when it comes to country, we have things such as loss and dispossession of land. We also have farming, land management, so you can take it a little bit more literal when it comes to country. You could also talk about migration and the identity of which countries you're from, which ones you're going to, which ones you've experienced. Cultural expressions such as country music, that works too. You could talk about connections to land, traditional, indigenous understandings of country as well, nostalgia, memory, local and international, the difference between the two for you as a student. A lot of these can be quite metaphorical. You can talk about imagined countries, imagined lands, lands that don't actually exist, place and belonging, and finally climate change and the environment. So there are a couple of options that are quite literal when it comes to country, and some others that are a little bit more abstract, some that are a little bit more personal experiences such as migration. You could look at it on a more global scale as well. There's lots of different options for you to consider within these elaborations. Let's talk about protest. Okay, so protest, as I said, one of the most popular ones. You could talk about successes and failures of protests in the past. You could talk about protest generally, the successes and failures of them. You could talk about specific movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter. You can also talk about events in history that were expressions of protest, group versus individual, okay? Figures that were involved in protest and that led change. You could talk about your personal connections and stories when it comes to protest, any types of conflict, struggles in war, outcomes of protest, the value of protest, the pros and cons of it. Is it actually achieving what people want it to achieve? Is there a line? Is there something as too far, perhaps? conflicts and contest, and finally, what does it even mean to protest? Okay, this one I found that a lot of schools had some trouble with because it's inherently got a slightly controversial nature. So I did find that some schools added their own rules about what could and couldn't be talked about. You'll suss it with your own school when it comes to this one. All right, personal journeys. I think this one is probably is my favorite one out of all of them for a broader cohort. It's very applicable to a lot of different people. So we can talk about storytelling and its ethics, all right? Whose story are we telling, all right? Who's allowed to say these things? Personal milestones in your life or in this made-up person's life that you connect to. Migration, movement, and disruption. I had a lot of students doing that one last year. The things that we experience when we go to new places, the struggles of it, the triumphs of it. You can also talk about stories that are missing, marginalized, that haven't really existed or been elevated in history or in the past, or even now, really. Expectations of change throughout a journey, and life and biography. So this one is quite broad, actually. There's a lot that you could bring into this. As long as you're focusing on the personal aspect of it, you don't necessarily have to do stuff that is uncomfortable for you to share, but you can use some of your own personal experiences and change it or adapt it to different situations so that you are most comfortable. All right, finally, play. I think this one, in all honesty, I found some of the best stories that my students wrote were ones that came out of play, but I do find its scope is a little bit more narrow compared to something like personal journeys, but it's still very interesting. So you can also talk about the issues and ethics around play, interpret play how you like in that scenario. You can talk about traditions and experiences of play, perhaps cultural differences as well. Cultural and historical representations of play, how playing has changed across time, what's allowed to be played, what's not allowed to be played, is it for children only, is it good for adults, etc. Language and images, the way it changes the experiences of play. Rules and rule breaking, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and how does that differ across groups. You could talk about acting, music, make-believe, the fantasy realm, basically. Games and sport. Digital versus analog. Hopefully we all know what that means, guys. We're in a very digital age, but a lot of people's experiences of previous generations, their playing was analog, okay? It was without the technology that we have today. Play mimicking real world experiences, and collaboration and connection. So all the different aspects of the way in which we engage with play, and play being quite broad concept. Okay, let's talk about some student interpretations from last year. I've kept it quite vague so no one knows exactly what was going on and who said it. So as I said, no one had country, but I did hear from some people about country, so I've included that. So a loss of a loved one and its association with a specific place. So the way in which this person experiences this place has differed after the person has passed away, unfortunately. And then another one of feeling like an alien on Earth with no belonging. So there is no country that this person feels that they belong to, that it's somewhere far away that they haven't been able to go back to. Protest, how generations of women had fought differently to get back to their home country. It was comparing the different types of protest and the levels of engagement with protest and the toll it took on these different women. A refugee realizing the irony of the current refugee policies and attitudes by a government with a colonial past. Yeah, that was a very good piece, actually. Extremely good. Personal journeys when it comes to fractured identity after moving countries, especially as a young person, and leaving behind a loved one in order to move on to a better life, right? That push and pull of, I really don't want to do this. However, my future looks pretty grim if I stay. And play, the perception of growing up changing when a young relative is killed, of how we want to grow up and everyone wants to be a kid again, and if I could be a child again, I'd do something so differently. There's all these push and pulls when it comes to growing up, and this person's perception being completely changed once their young relative passed away. And then the stakes of play being different for girls, the risks involved, the energy, the lack of opportunities, all changing depending on your gender expression. So here are my top tips when it comes to the framework of ideas. So the first one, connection to the framework of ideas. Make sure the connection is obvious, guys. The examiners can't follow up. They can't ask you more questions. They can't like have a dialogue with you and be like, what did you mean here? That isn't happening. And your teachers shouldn't be having that conversation with you either. They should be also engaging with a level of distance. However, there is some experience where teachers and even tutors, we know what you've been working on to some extent. We fill in gaps and try to remove them when we're marking. Personal connections. Pick something you care about, okay? Don't pick something that sounds cool, that you have no connection to, that you've got no care for it really. You just think it will work well, or you've heard someone do well with it because the examiner report said it or a teacher said it. No, pick it because you care about it. It will instantly make the writing so much better if you've got some ability to show a passion, a care, or a connection to it. It doesn't have to be something you've experienced yourself, like 100%, but something that you have a connection with, whatever that looks like, right? Finally, be unique. Try pick a nuanced stance on your framework of ideas, all right? There are thousands of students doing each framework of ideas. Roughly 40,000 that do the exam each year. Okay, if we were to literally split it down the line, there are 10,000 each. I don't think it will be 10,000 each, but let's say 10,000 other kids interpreting their framework of idea. Try pick something with complexity and nuance within that framework of idea that you have a connection to, right? Okay, I'm hopping all over the place. So, mentor texts, let's talk about them. What are they and what do you need to do with them? This is a list. I'm not going to go through them, okay? I'm not going to go through them. There's a list that VCAA provides. Your school is meant to pick at least 3 mentor texts from VCAA and can be supplemented with other texts. I did have a student last year that their teacher allowed them to add in their own mentor texts. However, I don't find that that's very common. Not many students of mine had that option. Usually they pick it for you. But there is a list and VCAA does descriptions for each of them. Have a look at the text list, okay? I'll insert an image here. The text list will have an outline of a description of what the actual mentor text is, the different techniques, the different structures, or the different genre or form or whatever it is that they use. So you can have a look to see what the strengths of those pieces are and if that aligns with what you want to explore. So what is the actual role of the mentor text? Essentially, the VCAA have outlined it is to model effective writing. Vocab, text structures, language features, blah, 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 that you can interweave together to craft a text that is compelling, right? It is helping you to get ideas that you can expand on. And it is inspiration for developing your writing process, okay? Basically, it is for you to learn from and grow from and then do your own thing. Now, when it comes to the SAC, this was frustrating for me as a tutor last year with kids from so many different schools. There was a huge variation of the engagement with mentor texts between schools. So schools choose, it is school choice on how they assess your writing's connection to mentor text. Some want a really explicit connection, okay? Some want you to be able to include a literal component of the mentor text, something so explicit, and put it in your piece. Others want a loose connection. Others want you to see some inspiration from the mentor text, okay? You usually explain the connection in your statement of intention or written explanation, whatever your school calls it. This varies. Some schools don't care about the mentor texts in the written explanation and in your SAC. They just want it in the process of you learning how to write a compelling text, okay? It will vary. Check with your school what they want. When it comes to the exam, however, it is not assessed. It is not in the rubric. Connection, they've described the connection to the mentor text as simply being the ways in which you use them in your creative process. The inspiration, the modeling of effective writing, etc. They're not looking for, they don't have the list of mentor texts next to them and they're looking for, okay, cool, I see a quote from this, or I see this exact same metaphor as you. They're not doing that. It does not need to be explicitly connected at all. Just inspiration in your writing process. But they're not looking for it. If it doesn't end up being an obvious inspiration, that is perfectly fine. Perfectly fine in the exam. All right, top tips when it comes to the mentor text: follow your school's advice. The SACs are designed by your school for your cohort. There are rules that they have to follow, but those rules are pretty broad, okay? Your school will decide what they think is best for your cohort. They're the ones marking it. Follow their instructions carefully. Okay, second, learn as much as you can from your mental texts. These are very well-established pieces of writing. Even if the topic doesn't match what you're talking about, look for the way in which it's written. Maybe it's about migration, but you want to talk about sport, but you both like using humor in your writing. Cool. Have a look at the way in which that humor was used. How can you implement humor in your writing if that's what you want to do? Finally, don't stress for the exam about it. It's not assessed in the exam, the mental texts. Treat them as guides, as opposed to something that you need to spend a lot of time adapting and connecting to. It's not like the old creative, where we had to base it off a text really explicitly. We had to write an alternate ending or a new scene or a different POV from my character. It's not like that. Okay, it's very different. In the exam, don't stress. Let's talk about audience, context, form, and purpose. These are outlined by VCAA. What are they? What do they mean? And how does that affect your writing? So, audience and context questions. VCAA have outlined a set of them. Topically. Power. Who holds the power? The writer, the audience, to what degree? Okay, these are somewhat, you're going to think, potentially strange questions, but important questions that you should be able to answer. Some schools may even use these questions in the written explanation. So who holds power in this scenario? Does the writer and the audience share the same cultural understandings? For example, I am going to talk about the experience of, I'm going to talk about having red hair. You can't really see in this lighting, but red hair. If my entire audience are brunettes and blondes, I will have to explain a little bit more to them about the experience of having red hair than if I spoke to an audience of everyone with dyed red hair. Does that make sense? The way you write your piece, depending on who's in your audience, will change what you say. If I'm a principal giving information about education and my entire audience is also in education, then I can skip some stuff. But if I'm talking to everyone in the room of different occupations, none of them to do with education, then I have to add in more so my speech makes sense. Social connections. How well do I know them and how well do they know me? If I'm doing a dialogue between me and my sister in a creative piece, in a creating text, that dialogue is going to need to show a lot more familiarity than if I'm talking about an interaction I had bumping into some random in the street. Okay. Formality and register. If I'm writing a piece of a professor doing a lecture, very formal. Again, let's go back to the family one. If I'm doing a discussion with my mum, that formality is going to be different. It's going to be quite informal when I'm talking to my mum compared to a professor giving a lecture at a university. The mode, how will they receive this? Okay, some options that you can write about is something like a podcast. So if you're writing the transcript of a podcast, we have to imagine that this is going to be listened to. How are you going to convey that? How are you going to convey differences that are going to be appropriate to listening? Are you going to include pauses, for example, silences, a cheerful tune? And you just write that, versus if this is going to be published in a magazine where we read it. And finally, where will they access it? Is this going to be something that's public or private? The entire time I've been talking, by the way, is about audience, your intended audience of your piece. I'm not talking about examiners or your teachers. No. I'm talking about who's your imagined audience of your actual piece. So all of these different things, the answers to these questions is going to differ how you write, and it should change how you write. That is going to show a difference in high standard pieces of writing versus lower ones. So let's talk about the purpose. VCAA have outlined 4 explicit purposes that you need to be targeting your writing towards. You pick, not all 4. You pick, all right? So they have written this explanation. So a student writer seeking to express, explain, reflect, argue, and it would differ. So let's talk about express. So if you're doing express, recounts, storytelling, narratives of the imagination that engage with, and then it's the same, actions, events, experiences, and or ideas. Explain, we're talking about cause and effect, consequences of different things. Reflect, exploring experiences of your own personal discovery or character's personal discovery that shape one's understanding of XYZ. And finally, argue a point of view. You're taking a stand. You're proposing solutions that you're trying to convince others of. All right? The purpose needs to be very explicit in your writing. I need to be, and your teacher and your examiner need to be able to read and go, yeah, they're explaining. They're doing explain. Because in the exam, there isn't a section for which purpose did you pick. They have to be able to ascertain that just by what they're reading. For your school, perhaps they may include a question like that in your written explanation. Perhaps, and that will help things. But for the exam, it won't be there. So let's talk about the forms and the types of writing. So this is what VCAA have outlined. That includes, but it's not limited to, these. All right? All of these is for the SAC and the exam. With the exception, the exam, the thing that they've explicitly said you can't do in the exam is poetry and songs. Sorry to songwriters out there that are really excited about that. You cannot do poetry and songs in the exam. Most schools also banned poetry and songs for the SAC because of the logic. You're going to spend all this time working on writing poetry and songs that you can't even continue that trajectory for the exam. You have to start learning a different form altogether. Now, I want to be very clear about this. A lot of schools narrowed this list down. A lot of schools said you have to specifically do this. Some schools took all choice away. Some schools took some choice away. Some schools took no choice away. That you could literally pick anything. Okay? So you follow what your school says. Do not argue with your school and be like, but VCAA lets me do blah, 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 blah. If it's really bad, have a conversation, a gentle one, okay? But your school is trying to do what they think is best for the cohort that you're in. There is another option when it comes to the exam, and potentially the SAC, if your school will let you, is called hybrid. Hybrid, you're combining different ones. VCAA have outlined that they're happy with this. They've included this, right? That you can combine options. So for example, a speech and an inner monologue, a speech within a short story, a letter and a short story, a memoir and a speech. Okay, some student options last year. So I had a student do a victim impact statement. So somewhat like a speech, but then it was published in a survivor's journal, and so there was also a description. There was other forms of writing around it. Another student did a memoir of a survivor's account, read out in a speech. Okay, so someone was giving a speech to a group and they read out a memoir of a survivor's account in the speech. Then a reflective letter, a letter to younger self. So some students have picked hybrid, some students picked one and just made it really unique to them. You do what your school says when it comes to the SAC, but in the exams, you are definitely allowed to do hybrids, as long as you adhere to the rules of each type. So when it comes to forms, recommendations, short stories are so hard to learn to do well in year 12. If you are really strong at it already, if you're really talented with short stories, go for it. Develop that skill. If you haven't written a short story since year 8, say, if you're not very good at it, please consider picking a different form. A lot of my student schools actually ban short stories because of their difficulty to do well in this assessment so quickly. Remember, schools are probably allowing you to do multiple options, pick from multiple options. That means that they're not going to teach one form explicitly for weeks and weeks and give you practice time and lessons over and over. They're probably going to allow you to explore what you want. Maybe they'll do a lesson on one thing, maybe a lesson on another, but it's not a deep dive on one type. So you should already have a strength in the form that you pick. Short stories are probably one of the hardest to get to do well in if you already aren't somewhat good at it. Hybrid is often recommended. I found by the time we reached exams last year, I had a lot of students tell me that my teacher is now recommending me hybrid. Okay, because it helps balance out the impact of the piece. You are able to explain some elements of your writing because you've included a speech, but you also are able to write quite beautifully and lyrically when you have a bit of a memoir included. Think about how your purpose can best be reflected when you pick your form. Okay, For example, when it comes to argue, speeches are often very good for argue, right? If you are doing a diary entry and you're trying to argue your point to your diary, it doesn't make as much sense as if you did a speech. So think about that. Where can a storytelling or a narrative of the imagination best fit? Which form? All right, top tips when it comes to the audience, the context, the purpose, and the forms. Don't get too carried away, all right, guys? You may have the most interesting idea in the world. And I've heard some really interesting ideas. All right, let's talk about top tips when it comes to the audience, the context, the form, and the purpose. First one, don't get too carried away. A lot of students have really brilliant ideas, but there is parameters around this task. Okay, don't get too carried away. Don't fly away past that. Think realistically in where you are at, the rules that you have to adhere to, and try write something that fits into that, because there are time limits. Most creating text pieces that are really amazing are realistic. Because I've had some students where I'm like, that would make the best novel. Best novel. Do you have time to write a novel? No. And that's the unfortunate thing about VCE, right? Tip number 2, examiners aren't in your head. They can't ask you any questions. They don't know you, all right? I found that as a tutor, sometimes I would fill in the gap because I've spoken about this creating text piece with a student for the last 5 weeks, that when I read a piece, I'm like, okay, yep, cool. My brain's making those connections already because I know the background. And same with your teacher, if they've spent time with you looking at your piece. Your examiner doesn't know you at all, doesn't know any of your background, doesn't know any of your experiences, doesn't know anything about you other than your student. I don't even think they get your student number, but anyway, other than the page that you give them. So what I recommend is give your piece of writing to someone that knows nothing about what you've written about. You haven't spoken about it with them at all. See if they can pick up all those different components. Last one, pick your form wisely, guys. Forms will make your idea more impactful or less impactful depending on the type, okay? Play to your strengths and play to the strengths of the idea, okay? All right, titles and stimuli. Okay, titles and stimuli. What do titles and stimuli have to do with your creating text? So, in the exam, this is a picture, by the way, of the sample exam that they provided early last year. So in the exam, you are expected to write in connection with the title that they provide you. In this case, My Country is Calling. And at least one of the 3 stimuli provided. So usually a quote of some sort, an image, and some prose at the bottom. The title connection is really, really vital, okay? It has to feel that you came up with that title, not that you were forced to write with it. And the stimuli also needs to be included. Of course, it needs to be included. So we need to be able to gauge that. That, though, is something that you can tick. Which stimuli number? Stimuli 2. Okay, we know that's what you're aiming for. So it's a little bit easier for examiners to work out what you were trying to do because you are being specific about which one you've picked. Okay, when it comes to the SAC, titles and stimuli, it is 100% up to your school. Most of my students last year, their schools did include it at least in one part of the SAC. At least. Some for both, right? That's when you had to do 2 texts. You may not do 2 texts this year. You may do just the one longer option. Some schools didn't include it at all, didn't want it at all. And they would just talk about it and practice it when it came to the exam. Whatever your school decides to do, do what your school says. I've said it a million times and I'll continue saying it. So let's talk about interpreting the title cleverly. All right, so stay young. This one is in connection to the framework of ideas of play. So let's talk about that. Things that you can think about to help you get a more clever or complex idea. So starting points. So what I like to do is think of what is the most obvious response. What comes to my brain straight away when I hear stay young? And can I adapt that in a way that makes it a bit more unique and nuanced? So get that obvious one and take it a couple of steps further. Can I imagine someone saying this or thinking this? All right, so if I close my eyes and I heard someone say stay young, I'm starting to picture who it is. Who are they? How would it make me feel? Who am I in that scenario as well? And how would they say it and think it? Do they mean it in a nice way? Are they trying to be rude to me? Are they coming with good intentions? Do I know this person? All of that will start helping you build a picture. And what are the implications for this title? Are there any double meanings here? Could 10 people in a room see this title and all think a different thing? Wonderful. Great. We want nuance. So let's get into some actual interpretations of these titles. You could talk about aging as a gift. Being able to get older is a gift. So otherwise, staying young is a curse. Blessing and a curse. Clearly, I forgot what my next line was. All right? Blessing and a curse. So for some, they view it as the best thing in the world, and others, it is the worst thing that could happen to them. Then you could talk about societal expectations of beauty. You can also talk about the dichotomy of expectations to mature and grow whilst remaining externally beautiful and youthful. Internally grow old and get mature. Gain knowledge, gain wisdom, but make sure you don't wrinkle. You could talk about beauty expectations, social media. How has our expectations of beauty changed on social media? Trends, etc. How younger and younger people are engaging with beauty expectations than in previous generations because of their access to this information and this, let's call it inspo for a lack of a better word. The ethics of body modification and its promotion. Is body modification in any shape or form ethical? Is it the promotion of it that's potentially got the ethics questions? Up to you what you want to talk about. The societal pressures of women to remain young looking. Okay. The desire to be seen as older when you're younger, but then when you're older, you want to be seen as younger. All right. When you're 16, 17. Oh, really? I look 19? Oh, wow. Cool. When you're 50, turn around. Oh, my goodness. Really? You think I'm 40? Amazing. Amazing. How that differs. All right. If we called a 7-year-old and said, you look 95, people would be freaking out. But when we're young, we feel like being called older for some strange reason. We just want to be more mature. We want to grow up when we're young. And the loss of life too young. So staying young by force, unfortunately. Okay. Let's talk about stimuli. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. This is from country. Okay. So that's typically used for environmental issues. I've seen it a lot when it comes to global warming and climate change, that we need to be responsible for the actions we put in place in order for our future generations to be able to even have a sustainable earth to be living on, right? This stimuli alludes to consequences of actions, all right? So often we think about the impact on ourselves and those immediately around us, but this one alludes to consequences beyond us, beyond our generation. That it's a privilege to be on this earth and to be in charge of it and responsible for it, rather than something that we're entitled to. We are not entitled to this earth. We have borrowed it. Cyclical living, what we do impacts the next person, what the next person does impacts the next thing, etc., etc. We're constantly inheriting and borrowing the earth from each other. That there is no single ownership. You could talk about that we are constantly sharing resources and borrowing it from each other. That there is responsibility here, and that there is finite time and resources. So if you get this, you don't have to be talking about environmental issues. You don't have to be talking about the earth literally. You could talk about any of these aspects of this stimuli and adapt it into your writing. All right, let's talk about another one. Let's talk about this hand-holding moon one. So both of these from the sample exam. Okay. So a fantastical existence, magic, right? That moon is glowing. Maybe this existence isn't real. You could maybe talk about things going environmentally wrong. Has things gotten so bad that the moon is now glowing, that there's some sort of reaction happening out there? that humanity is holding power, that the world, the planets, whatever you want to say, is in our hands, that we exist within a larger system beyond us, but maybe we've shrunk it, we've taken control of it, taking advantage of it, that there is light amongst the darkness. That could be a way that you take it down. We are responsible for the continued existence of our world, and that there is power in our solar system, world, planets. Okay, so again, doesn't have to be about space. Doesn't have to be about the Earth. As long as it fits with your framework of ideas. In this case, it was a country, and that you interpret something from the stimuli that is obviously in the stimuli. All right, let's talk about the final one. My country is too far to reach, but will always remain a part of me. All right, migration, dispossession, as we were saying earlier, that country is an intangible concept. Okay, that it's not a literal place, perhaps. Maybe it's a bit more metaphorical to you or abstract. The internalized ideas that we gain from about country, from our experiences, the way in which our identity is formed, that country is, however you interpret country, is literally a part of your identity. That there is change and there is metamorphosis going on, that you were once somewhere, you've gone somewhere else in the literal sense, but also in the metaphorical sense, and that transformed you. Physical distance, an obvious one. You can take the person out of blah, but you cannot take the blah out of this person. Okay, we've all heard that phrase used differently. Attempts to go home, failing, so too far to reach. You've ascertained that you can't go back for whatever reason, and so you can't go back home. Connecting to a place that is far. How do we connect to it? Through music, traditions, ideologies, religion, social clubs, whatever it is for you. Yes, these are all different ways that we can interpret the stimuli in a more clever way. So, top tips when it comes to titles and stimuli: think deeply. Remember, again, if we split it evenly, roughly 40,000 kids doing each framework of ideas, roughly, if it's even, which I don't think it is, as I said before, 10,000 kids are looking at the same title in the exam and the same 3 stimuli. All right, if we split that 10,000, one picks one, which doesn't always happen. There tends to be a more popular choice, and some people do more than one. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. So think of the intricacies that the titles and the stimuli are presenting to you, right? And try explore that in connection to your piece of writing. Your title, your stimuli and your title don't always have to be a good thing. For example, that stay young one. A lot of people, when I was practicing with them for that title, they were saying, oh, it's, we need to be young at heart. We need to be children again. Yep. Okay, cool. That's cool. But then when the student turned around and said staying young is a curse because she lost a relative at a very young age, that flipped it on its head. That was personal. That was unique. That was more unique than be young at heart, guys. Stay young. You know, we get too serious as an adult. So turn it on its head. Ask yourself, what if blank is a bad thing? It does not have to be inspirational to have an impact, guys. So more stimuli also does not necessarily include higher marks. Pick the stimuli that works for your piece, that you can find a nuanced connection to your piece. If you shove all 3, it becomes muddy. Choosing more than one should only be done if you can include them equally well. Wow, I've got 2 that fit perfectly. Okay, put it in, no problem. But don't sit there and go, how am I going to fit all 3? All right, how? I need to change my piece. How am I going to do this? No, just pick the one that fits the best. The final component, guys, the VCAA rubric. What does VCAA expect of you from the exam? Let's go through the rubric together. So in the SAC, as I've said in the past, schools use whatever they like. They can use the VCAA rubric that they create as a template for the SACs, or they can adapt it, or they can make their own. Remember, schools design SACs for their cohort. That means you ask your mate at a different school, you're doing the same framework of idea, you're doing the same year 12, both of you, right? And you will likely be assessed differently, or at least the teaching of the unit will be different. Okay, the rubric may be different. the chances of things being different from student to student at different schools is huge. So when it comes to the exam, there is one public rubric that all examiners use to mark creating text responses for every single Victorian student sitting the exam. So that is the one we have access to. I mean, we have the template as well, but it's not guaranteed that your school's going to use it. The exam one, we know. So on the right is the VCAA rubric. You can check it out yourself in full form with the other ones. So there are 3 components, 3 dot points, 3 that are assessed. The first one, your connection to your framework of idea, your title, and your stimuli. Second, how organized your piece is, the purpose of it, the voice that you're using. And thirdly, literally how you write, how you wrote it. So the first component, the connection to the framework of ideas, title, and stimuli. There are 2 elements within the first component, the title and the stimuli, and the framework of ideas. So the ideas raised by the title and stimuli, and your connection to your framework of ideas. So let's have a look at this actually as a full sentence. The first one, let's have a look. So demonstrates insightful consideration of the ideas raised by the title and stimulus in connection with the framework of ideas. So that's what we're working with. So I'm going to sit here for a second so you can see this. On this side, all the way down, all the purple ones, this is the ideas raised by the title and stimuli. I'm going to block it so we can talk about this. These are the descriptions used at each level from 4 to 10 for the ideas raised by the title and stimuli. So we've got insightful consideration. Your consideration of it is accurate and deep, right? You've got a deep understanding that is perceptive and carefully thought out, right? You've weighed up options, you've explored it deeply, you've considered the complexities and the nuances, and you've carefully picked how you're going to adapt your piece and your ideas to the title and stimuli provided. Astute exploration. You've made an accurate assessment of what the title and the stimuli are providing you, and you have examined and explored those options. Okay, so the main difference between a 9 and 10 and an 8 in the description is the 9 and 10 is a little bit more complex, a little bit more nuancy. Okay, perceptive. You've noticed stuff that many other people haven't noticed. Number 8 is that you've considered options that are viable that have come from it, and you have explored them. You've picked one that works really well, you've picked a few, you've explored it really well in your piece, and you've developed it in your piece. Detailed connection. There are many details in your piece that are linked and associated with it. The connections are detailed. Clear connection, it's obvious. I can see how you use the title and stimuli. Well done. Adequate, it's there. It's there. Basic, it's there. It's there, but I had to struggle to find it. It's not strong, basically. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the framework of ideas. Framework of ideas has way less of descriptions, right? So the 9 and 10 one and the 8 one is that there is a connection to the framework of ideas. Doesn't need to be crazy, guys. The title and stimuli have a lot more detail in the way in which it differs from each level and how you're responding to it. The framework of ideas, is it connected? Is it related? Is it referenced? That's it. Not too hard when it comes to the framework of ideas to reach that top level, because the whole year you've been working on your framework of ideas, you've been developing your piece, so it should naturally have a connection. Second component, the second dot point. This is how organized your text is with a purpose and a voice. So 3 considerations: the organization of the text, the connection to the purpose, and the use of voice in your writing, the 3 different colors on that line. So I'm going to move out of the way briefly so we can see it as a full sentence. So creates a cohesive text with an explicit purpose and an appropriate voice. That is an example from the 9 and 10 section of the rubric. Let's talk about second component, the overall organization of the piece, and specifically looking at the organization of the text. So we've got cohesive text, coherent text, coordinated text, connected text, organized text. Cohesive. All parts of your piece work together and boost each other up, bolster each other up. They're all working to elevate each other. Coherent at a level 8. It is a unified whole. Okay, the piece works with one another. It's great. It looks like everything's meant to be with each other. Wonderful. Coordinated. Different parts brought together and just work together. Connected, associated and related parts organized, arranged systematically. All right, so organize is pretty basic, right? Is there any structure in this piece? Yeah, there's a couple of paragraphs, there's this, there's that. Makes sense? Yeah, great. Cohesive is everything fits together so well and boosts each other up. Every part of it should be there. Every part of it is helping the rest of the piece. Coherent, it's unified, coordinated, it works. Connected, it's connected. Organized, it's organized. Okay. Let's talk about purpose. Okay. Explicit purpose, clear purpose, linked purpose. Explicit, no room for doubt. I can so tell what purpose you've picked. There's no doubt in my mind which purposes that you have picked. Clear, I can find it. I see that you used explain. Easy. Linked, yeah, okay, it looks like an argue. Awesome. All right. Similar to the framework of ideas stuff, it shouldn't be hard for you to get to explicit if you've been working with a similar purpose the whole year or for a long period of time. If you decide on the day, could be different. All right. Finally, your use of voice. Is it appropriate? And is there some awareness of voice? That is it. That is it. Appropriate goes all the way down to 5. 4 and below is some awareness. We should be able to do appropriate voice. And what that means is the formality, the register, the type of language that that person is using makes sense for the piece. Third dot point, the third component, your language, vocab, text structures. Now, there's 2 considerations in it. Control of writing and effective use of writing. Okay, they sound very similar and they are somewhat similar. They work well with, they work with each other basically. So let's have a look at an example sentence. So demonstrates, we're looking at 9 and 10, third dot point. Demonstrates sophisticated control of language and text structures that makes rich use of vocabulary and language features. Your control of writing. Are we having sophisticated control of writing? High degree of complexity. You're experimenting with quite advanced levels of writing and you're executing it well. Confident. Do you sound confident? Are you writing with certainty that what you're including works and is doing what it's meant to do? Sound, right? You've used good judgment, it's in good condition, it works. Clear, easy to see your control of your writing. It's there is some control. Adequate control, basic control. I don't think I need to explain the adequate and basic. All right. Sophisticated and confident, main difference is someone writing sophisticatedly at a 9 and 10 is essentially writing probably above what you would typically expect at year 12. They are using skills that are well refined. They're taking risks that are paying off. Let's talk about effective use of writing. Okay, so this is rich, thoughtful, clear, effective, some, simple, right? So thoughtful use of vocabulary and language features. So rich, there is an abundance of vocab and language features that you have used well in your writing and is elevating what you're wanting to say. Okay. Thoughtful, you've considered different ones. You've thought about different options and you've used it and you have used it well. Clear, it is easy to see that you have used different vocabulary and language features for your piece and for what you're trying to do. Effective, yeah, it's doing what it's meant to do. It is doing what it's meant to do, your writing. That you use some vocab and language features, simple vocab and language features, all right? Most people should be able to reach a little bit higher than simple. If we're making effort with it and we've been practicing it for a while and adapting, we should be able to get above that. So my top tips when it comes to the rubric and VCAA end of year exam. Holistic marking. Right, VCAA always says that they mark holistically, that there is not one part of your piece that is more important than others. Okay, make sure you put effort in all components. Now, title, stimuli, and framework of ideas. These components are the tasks themselves. Make sure that these connections are visible to someone who doesn't know you. You can write the most beautiful piece. And some students of mine wrote the most beautiful, gut-wrenching pieces of writing that I'd ever read last year, but they weren't really making a connection to their framework of idea. They were just writing whatever they wanted. And they weren't writing in response to title and stimuli. You can't give them a high mark because they're not doing the task. All right, so make sure you put in effort in those areas. Finally, SAC versus exam. Exam is likely a different task to your SAC, and that's for all of the English areas, right? It's likely a different task. For SACs, your school marks it, your teachers mark it, or they may hire someone to mark it, but it's their rules, okay? For the exam, VCAA examiners are marking it. Make sure you are aware of what the different expectations are of you in your SAC versus your exam. Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you've made it to the end. I am sure it's been a long journey of watching this video. I really hope that it helps you in your creating texts and you write the most amazing pieces of writing and that this helped you. Obviously, this is an overview of a study design. Study design is long, it's intricate. A lot of the stuff is referenced to your school because your school makes a lot of decisions when it comes to the SACs. Hopefully we can get some more details of each of the components eventually at some point, but this should be a good starting point. So remember, at the end of the day, your SACs are by your schools, the exams by VCAA. When it comes to the creating text, explore what you find works for you, what you enjoy, what you care about, the forms that you like writing in. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Feel free. Let me know if you liked this video, if you found it helpful. Or you can shoot me an email. My email is eleni@learningloft.com.au. You can have a look at our website, learningloft.com.au as well. You can have a look at my TikTok, tutor.eleni. There's more videos there, more short form videos. Thank you once again from Learning Loft Education. We hope that you find this super useful. If you want to inquire about tutoring, feel free to go to our website and fill out the inquiry form there, or have a suss of the things that we are about. Amazing. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. Bye. Once we